install this processor. It's a 3700X processor into a Gigabyte B550i motherboard. It's a Mini-ITX. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this block of aluminium, so it gives me more access to put the cooler on. Let's take that off now. Right, so the first thing is let's undo the arm. So undo the arm until it's straight. That releases the socket and allows the pins to go in. You have to be incredibly careful with the processor, because on the AMD processors the pins are on the actual processor. Right, let's grab the processor, and you can see there's no end of pins, and if you bend or break them it won't work anymore. Right, so the thing to look for is on the motherboard there's a little triangle. You can just see it in this location here. So there's a little triangle there, and we need to make sure the processor goes on the right way. So on the front side of the processor you can actually just see a very tiny triangle in that corner. To make sure it's the right triangle, if we flip it the other side you can see a bigger triangle there. So it's that triangle that needs to line up with that corner to make sure you've got it the right way round. So it actually goes on that way round. Yep. So let's just align it. So it's just trying to align it as best as possible. There we go. And that's gone in. I always give it a bit of a press down to make sure it's not sitting proud, and it is actually in the socket properly. But that looks okay, and it's just a fraction movement in there, so that's okay. So the processor is in. Let's put the arm down over the little catch. So you've got the catch at that location. It's now caught, and that's grabbed the CPU. Right, this particular processor comes with the Prism cooler, and the Prism cooler's got the thermal paste already applied, and it's not quite how they used to do it. It looks like there's a lot less thermal paste on there than they used to put on in the past. It looks quite good actually, so let's try and put this on. You shouldn't really need to force this into place. It should go on nice and easily if you get it the right way around. On this particular motherboard, the fan header is at this location, and I want to make sure the cable is the same side. It probably would reach from the other side, but I'm going to keep it this side, I think. So I'm going to put the cooler on in that orientation. So you got this spring clip mechanism to hold the cooler in place. So what I do is just push that right there, so that's at maximum extension. And the socket itself, it's got sort of on the clips a piece that bottoms the cooler out at this point and this point, and it sort of sits in here and sits on top here. So let's have a go. Right, so what we're trying to do now is tilt the cooler this way fractionally, so I can hook it round this this hook. Let's see if I can. So you got the hook there, so I'm trying to tilt it around the hook. There we go. Right, so that's now sitting against the socket. It's on there. Coming around to the other side. You can see it's not quite in the right place, so I need to move that out. There we go. So there's no need to force the cooler down. It should just fit in there nicely. So I always double check to make sure it's definitely on the hook, and that side looks okay, and that side looks okay. Now I'm checking the distance to the socket, and it probably could go over that way a fraction, so I might just push it a fraction. There we go. So now it's sitting in the middle of the socket. Right, so now what we need to do is It's sitting on there nicely. Now we need to tighten it, and it's this lever arm here that we need to tighten, and it wants to go, it's like on a cam, so it wants to move in that direction. So what I want to do is I'm just going to push down gently on the top of the CPU cooler and push that in that direction. Make sure it's on all the way down. There we go. So the lever arm there, it's straight. Now that is on solid. We can lift the board up now with that, and now I can just plug in this. Let's see which way around. Let's go that way around. Let's have that do. And then just push down. Make sure it's bottomed out. Yep. And that's how we install that processor. Right, so the cooler's in position, the fan's plugged in, but now we need the lights to work. So it comes with these two cables, and the one I'm going to use is the one that goes into the USB. I think it's this one. It's got the USB end on it. Let's take that off. Right, so on the cooler itself, on the side, there's these like two rubber plugs. I think the one on this side is for this connector that's in the box. The one we want is actually on the right side. Let's take this little plug off. You can see the 4 pins, and we've got the cable. Just making sure you get the cable the right way around. So let's look up. Right, so the pins are lower down than the center line, and on here they're lower down that way around, so it goes in that way around. And it's just gently pushing it in. Right, looks like it's in. Not sure, yeah, it's in. And then this goes into your USB header. So looking at this board, there's quite a few different headers on it. I'm not quite sure which one's which. Usually the pins will tell you which one's the right header. So in this particular case, the very bottom one here is the one that's blanked out. And generally speaking, I don't think you can get it the wrong way around. So that header there is not the right one because it's not got the right pin, nor is that one. If we look over here, that one looks like it's the right header, and I can just see on the board, very, very small, it says USB 1 on the board, so I know that's the right header. Just got to match the way around that this goes on there. So the pin that's blanked off is this one, and that's the hole that's blanked off, so it has to go around that way around. Okay. And that's now on. So basically I'm looking at putting the M.2 drive in, and it goes at this location. You need to make sure you get the right screwdriver for these screws. They're quite tight, so you don't want to round the heads off. So you want to make sure you get the right screwdriver. And this looks like it's just a big heat sink or a big aluminium block. I don't actually think it does a lot, more for show than anything else. Underneath we've got the heatsink for the M.2 drive, which is shown here. So you need to take that out first. It helps if you've got a magnetic screwdriver, so you don't lose the screw. And we're talking tiny threads here, so be careful you don't lose it. So then that should come out. So it lifts up, slides out. And on the back of that we've got some tape, and basically what you do is you pull that off and stick it to the drive, and that acts as a heatsink for the drive. This drive's a WD Blue SM550, and you can see it's got chips on one side, nothing on the other side. It wants to go that way around with the chips up. Also there's a little cutout at the front there. The cutout is at the front rather than at the back. So we've moved that. Now this is quite interesting. It's a little bit different to most installation of M.2 drives. Most drives you can just put the drive across and it rests on the post, and you just screw it to the post. With this particular one, it's a little bit different. So you've got the post at the bottom, and then there's another little piece at the top. You need to remove that piece at the top before you put the drive in. You put the drive in, then you've got to put this piece back on top, then you've got to attach the heatsink. So it's a little bit different. It's quite difficult to get to, and you need to be quite careful trying to undo it. Pliers are not the best, but it's the only thing I've got that fits. So we're taking that little piece off. And we're talking tiny, tiny threads. So that can come out. Right, so now the drive's ready to go in. Let's make sure everything's at the bottom, it's clean. Right. So let's try and put the drive in. You can see there, it's got the little cutout there. So you want to line the drive up with a little cutout and then gently push. There you go, now that's in. And now we need to push the drive down and put that post back on. This is the difficult bit. It's very, very fiddly, especially on my big fingers. I think it's probably easier with a little screwdriver actually, a little magnetic screwdriver on the top, gently pushing on top to align it maybe. Let's have a look. Oh yeah. So yeah, it's not got a screwdriver slot in the top, but I'm just using a little bit of pressure on the top thread just to wind it in. And you can see there that it's now winding in nicely. Right, so I've not put over a lot of pressure on it. Now I'm just going to do it a little bit finger tight. Right, that's finger tight and that's plenty. Drives in nice, it's all lined up and it's flat. If you put this on top of this, the drive will be at an angle and it won't fit properly. So it needs to be under that little post. Right, so then we've got the heatsink. We've got the heatsink and it's got the tape on it. So now we can take the tape off. And it's got the thermal pad on the bottom. So now this can go in here. So it slots in at this gap, comes down. And let's make sure it's seated right there. So yeah, that's now seated correctly at this end. Now I can put the little screw back in. Little magnetic screwdriver. And we can tighten that back up. Again, it doesn't need to be, it's just nipped nice and gently. And that's reasonably, it does move a fraction, but it's reasonably good. That will stick there nicely. Right, so that's in. Now we can put the heatsink back on, or the big block. It's a bit odd the way this is. This is actually the heatsink, the piece that's in here, and you're just relying on this, touching this if you want to transfer any heat into this big block. So this big block's not really doing a great deal, I don't believe. It might even be better thermally, leaving this block off and just leaving it like that, allowing the air from the cooler to run over the heatsink. But I'm going to put it back on anyway. Just need to make sure we line the holes up. It's quite difficult knowing where they are. There you go, it's starting to screw in. So it must be somewhere near. Right, I'll just nip that. Just nip that. It's nipped. Nipped. And that's the drive in. Right, so we've got the Raijintek Metis Plus, I think it's called. went for this case because it's quite small, ideally sized for a Mini-ITX build. Don't see the point in going Mini-ITX unless you're going to get a small case. Right, so what's inside? Top off. The bottom. I think the black one looks quite good in comparison to some of the colours. Basically, most of it's an aluminium case. It actually looks quite nice, this black one. Yeah, so we've got a fan in the back, little window. Little window, it's been covered up. Got a vent in the top. The USB 3 sockets by looking at it. Earphones and microphone socket. Single power button on the front. And it looks like the power supply actually goes in the bottom, or at the front at the bottom here. Right, let's open it up and have a quick look. The screws are actually quite small, so you've got to make sure you use the right screwdriver so you don't round the heads off. They're quite tight actually. You don't want to lose these, they're absolutely tiny. I think the front panel looks quite nice, it's quite thick. The side panels are quite thin, the rest of it looks a bit thin. And I think the back panel is probably steel, but the rest of it looks like aluminium. Just remove this. So it's been anodised both sides. Got like a nice brushed finish on it. That side's just standard. This side's got the brush finish on. Have a quick look at it. We've got the fan. The airflow is a bit strange on this case actually, the way it works. This fan's set up to exhaust, take the air out at the back. The problem is the power supply is going to sit in the front, and the fan on the power supply is going to go in this direction, and the fan on the back is going in this direction. It's one of the reasons why I'm using a standard AMD cooler. I normally would have put like a Hyper 212 cooler on this sort of arrangement. The problem with the Hyper 212, you need to point it either in this direction or in this direction, depending on where you want the air to go. I don't think it's ideal for this particular case. So I've chosen to go with the downward firing CPU cooler, the standard one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this fan off, the back fan, and reverse the direction of the airflow. So I'm going to pull air in this way, so it feeds the downward firing fan, and also the PSU cooler will take the air out and underneath the case. I think that's going to be the best way. Yep, let's have a quick look at the back. So I think this is standard steel. It's quite thin actually in places. Yeah. It's a bit thin. But again, it's not bad for this sort of money. These are around £50. So it's not bad for this sort of money. And we're going to do a build in this case. I've already built the motherboard up with CPU, hard drive and RAM is already installed. I'm going to put that into this case. It's going to be quite a challenging build to try and get to all the screws and things. There's different ways of approaching this. This particular case, there's actually screws all the way around it, so you can take all the panels off and build the bottom panel, which will allow you to get to all the sockets and things on the motherboard, but it can be a bit time consuming. So I'm going to try to take the minimum off the case and build it that way around, but obviously I'm going to struggle to get to some of the screws on the motherboard, especially this back one here. That one's going to be quite challenging, and the one down there may be quite challenging as well to get to. This one's probably going to be worse actually, but we'll see when we come to build it. Right, so I think the best thing to do with this Raijintek case to get the motherboard in is to actually take the bottom of the case off first. The reason why is, on the motherboard there's a screw hole at this location, and this one goes into here. With the underside of the case on, it's almost next to impossible to get that screw in. So it's a lot easier taking the back off the case. And also you've got the CPU power to plug in. And again, it's a lot easier if it's done like so. Just line up the back. Yeah. Line the holes up. That's it. So I just need screwing in, but now I can get to this screw at that location. Well, the actual instructions for the case say use the longer screws. So there's one of the longer screws, and there's one of the shorter screws. However, I've just seen a slight issue. On the back of the motherboard, I've tightened this screw up, and it's got the motherboard. It's actually holding it nice and tight. At the front, if you look there, the screw's actually quite tight now. The screw's tight, but the motherboard's moving. So I think at this location I'm going to put in one of the smaller screws so it's tightened down to the motherboard. So you probably just want to check that when you're finished, that it's actually got the motherboard. Right, I had a bit of a problem with the graphics card seating correctly in the PCI Express slot. It seems to go in okay at this end, but at this end it won't go in very well. And what I found out is it's actually some cutouts. Some cutouts just here, and they're a little bit on the thin side. They need opening out a fraction this way, making a fraction bigger. There's one here and one here. So basically the metal here wants pulling out a fraction here and a fraction here, likewise this end and this end. It's quite difficult here with the motherboard in the way, but it's just about doable. And then when you try and push the card in, it will sit nicely. Right, so I'll plug the CPU cable. So the CPU cable wants to go in on the motherboard just there. Make sure you try and get it the right way around. The other end of the cable, it goes in the Corsair power supply. I think it says type 4 on it. Probably just about see. It says type 4. That goes into the power supply end. And one that says CPU on it goes into the CPU socket, or the CPU power supply, which is on the motherboard just there. Beauty of having cables like this is we can do this now without having the power supply attached. It makes it a lot easier connecting this connector. You can push it in, make sure it's clicked in properly. You need to make sure it goes over the latch so it can't accidentally come out. Right, so I've just turned the case around. I've put the bottom plate back on. The next thing I tend to do, so I've put the CPU power supply cable in, but I've not put the main 24-pin connector in yet. I think the hardest thing to do next is to put the front panel headers in, because they're so small. This is probably the only thing I use the manual for, and what you're trying to look for is the front panel header, and what you want to know is which pin goes where, as it were. This particular case hasn't got a reset switch, but all the other pins we've got. One thing to make sure is ideally what you want is the plus and minus, the negative and positive, to go the right way round, as it's telling you in the book. and on the actual cables themselves, the positive's actually got a little arrow, arrow on it. I'm not quite sure if I can pick that up because it's so small. Let's have a quick look, see if we can see. Oh, there you go. So on the back of the cable, that little arrow, that little triangle, is telling us that that is the positive cable, because these are all black cables, so you can't tell by the colour. You need to look at the little triangle, and that's telling me that particular cable is positive, so I know which way around it goes. With some of the cables, it's very hard to see, but with some of the cables there's only a 1 pin on there. It's a 1 pin cable, so it's probably best to try and line up the writing on the connectors. So especially the ones where you got 1 pin, try and keep the writing all on the same side, because the square can be slightly different length in one direction to the other direction. So it's better to make sure they're aligned with all the writing the same way, if that is in accordance with the pin count. So yeah, you'll find they fit a lot better all together if they're matching with the writing the same way on the single pins. Right, so we've plugged in the front panel headers. So we can just have a quick look. So they're all in. The front panel audio header is now in. It's over there. And the USB 3, the front case USBs have been plugged in. So right, so the next thing to do is I need to sort the power supply out. The power supply, because it's an SFX, it comes with a little bracket to turn it into an ATX, because we've got an ATX hole in this case. So I could have put an ATX power supply in, but I prefer putting the smaller one in just to give you a bit more space. So the problem with this is it comes with a bracket. So we've got a bracket that actually comes with it. It's a Corsair one, which they give you for free, as it were. Right, so we've got the bracket. The problem with the bracket is it's going to catch at this location with the cable. So what we need to do is we need to cut the bracket here and here, take that piece out so we can fit it in here and not have problems with the cable which comes through at that location. Right, the power supply is actually going to fit in here anyway. So the power supply is going to make it stiff across this location anyway, so you don't really need that piece there, and it's going to be out of the way of the cable now. Strange thing about this case is actually the motherboard is actually upside down, so the graphics card's actually at the top in this case. One of them ITX quirks, I suppose. Right, so we've got the hole in the bottom for the power supply. And what I want is I want the fan on the power supply to point next to the fan on the CPU cooler. So it's not pointing directly at the thicker aluminium plate at the front. So I've just cut away the bracket a little bit. So the bracket wants to go on in this direction onto the power supply here. So I'm about to put the bracket on there like so, and then fit it from the inside of the case. Right, it's probably a little bit dark here. So this is how it should look when you've got it together. The screws you want are one there. You don't want one on the end, otherwise it will catch the case. You want one at the top and one on the left. Right, so now's the time I would recommend putting the speaker in. So I've just put the speaker in. You can probably just see there, the speaker's attached. Make sure you get it the right way around, positive and negative. And now I think is the time to put in that 24 pin on the motherboard before we put the power supply in, so I'm not struggling to get to it. Right, so I've now put in 24 pin. Just make sure you push it all the way in. It's best to wobble it a little bit on this end and then the other end, this end, the other end, until it goes all the way down. And make sure the catch is grabbed hold of the other part of the motherboard, so it can't accidentally be pulled out. With this extension power cable here, make sure this is high up at this end. You want the cable to come down under and wrap round this way, so you can wrap it round into the underside of the power supply. What you don't want is to kink the cable. You want a nice bend radius going round and back into the socket, so it doesn't damage the cable. And to do that, it's better if before you put the power supply in, if this is higher, it's going in the right direction. Right, so I've just connected the power supply. There's a screw at the top here. There's one here, and one through this hole in the case. So if you look, the feet are here. I've removed the foot here, and I've removed the foot here to put the screws in to connect the power supply bracket. Now I just need to put the feet back on, and the feet have basically got a screw in it. So it's got a screw in the foot, and there's a bit of a plastic piece on there. That plastic piece goes into that hole on the case, and the screw goes into there, so you can't really go too far wrong. Just don't try and over tighten them, you just squash the rubber. Right, so when it's finished, it should look something like that. So the cable is coming round and into the socket, and there's no sharp bend radiuses. So this case comes with a fan at the rear, and it's an LED fan, and it lights up white. There's actually on the cable a little button. If you press the button, the fan comes, the LEDs come on and go off with a little button. However, on this particular fan, there's a Molex connector and a 3-pin motherboard connector. So I've connected this up via the 3-pin motherboard connector. The other connector, the Molex connector, basically what I've done is I've put electrical tape around it, and I've taped it up to make sure if a screw falls into it, you can't get any short circuits. So I'd advise either cutting the Molex connector off and make sure you can't get any short circuits on the wires, or to tape it up. I've just used electrical tape on it and taped it up. Now the fan at the back, when it's connected to the motherboard 3-pin header, it actually works. It comes on when the fan goes over about 1000 RPM. So you need to adjust your motherboard settings to make sure the fan runs over 1000 RPM, and then the light will come on. If it's running slower than 1000 RPM, the light on the back won't actually come on. So that's one of the key things to making it work. Now, the actual airflow on this case, it's a bit strange. Originally, I had the fan at the rear sucking air in to the CPU cooler. Now, I've also got a graphics card on this particular computer, and it's a 1650 Super, so it's a 100-watt graphics card. Now, when you're playing games and it's flat out, i.e. you're using the 100 watts totally, the actual front of the case starts to heat up if you've only got the one fan in and pulling air over the CPU cooler. So the CPU stays nice and cool, but the graphics card gets quite warm, and it goes up to about 78 degrees C, which is a little bit too high really. But the main issue is around the front left of the case, so sort of in this area, the actual case gets very, very hot to touch. It's quite surprising. I think this is because the air can't escape fast enough outside the case. And obviously, being aluminium, it's going to heat up quite quickly. So what I've done now is I've put a fan at the top. I've used a Noctua fan here, and it's one of the grey ones that runs up to 1700 RPM. That fan is it's an excellent fan. I've used it before, and the way I've set this up, under normal conditions, the fan in the top runs around 600 RPM. The rear fan runs about 1100 RPM, and the AMD CPU cooler fan runs about 1300 RPM. And that's initially how I've set it up. With the airflow running in this configuration, bringing air in through the top and out at the back, it's actually the best configuration for when you've got a graphics card. If I didn't have a graphics card and I had onboard graphics, I'd just bring in air from the rear of the case over the CPU, and that would be the best scenario. So with the scenario I've got now, I've got a graphics card, I'm bringing air in at the top and out at the back, and the graphics card now runs around 63 degrees C, and the CPU cooler's gone up by about 3 degrees in this configuration. So the CPU's raised by about 3 degrees, but the graphics card's probably come down right by about 15 to 20 degrees. So I think that's the best configuration. Plus the case is staying nice and cool now. So that's how we get this this case running with a nice airflow over it. And I think with this sort of airflow, the component should last a long time. Okay guys, thanks for watching.